I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from first-time guest Michael F. Duggan, whose work you can read at Counterpunch. He formerly ran the Realism and Policy blog and talks about a concept he calls moderate realism. He's influenced by foreign policy thinkers of the 20th century, like, most notably, George Kennan, the man who gave us containment theory in the Cold War. And we're going to be talking about regionalism, multipolarity, and moderate realism in the conversation to follow. You may not agree with everything that Michael has to say, and I know a lot of people have issues with realism. I'm interested in realism within international relations theory. Sometimes I have disagreements with realists, other times I align more closely with them, and I find it an interesting and often fruitful form of thought. I don't think any one model or way of thinking about international relations is necessarily a silver bullet with all the answers, but there's a lot to be gleaned, I think, from realist thinkers like Kennan and Morgenthau, as well as the neo-realists like Mearsheimer and Kenneth Waltz. So I hope you'll listen to this with an open mind, as I did. It's more a conversation than a debate. There's things we disagree with that we don't really get into as much, but maybe in a future episode we will. In any case, I hope you'll enjoy the conversation with Michael F. Duggan. Before we get to that, though, I'd like to remind you that this show is, with the exception of its one sponsor, Mike Swanson of the mighty Wall Street Window, entirely listener-funded. So please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And also check out wallstreetwindow.com, the mighty Mike Swanson. It is a great financial and trading newsletter. I've had listeners make return on investment due to Mike's trading tips. And of course, if you sign up to the newsletter now, I believe you can still get a copy of Mike's ebook free of charge, The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I've ever used. Check it out at wallstreetwindow.com. And with that being said, let's get to the conversation with Michael Duggan. Welcome to Parallax Views, the first-time guest on the program, and I hope we'll have many more conversations if this one goes well, which I think it will. I'm talking with Mike F. Duggan, who holds a doctorate from Georgetown University in American History, a minor in modern Europe, and a collateral concentration in Western philosophy. I stumbled across his work recently at Counterpunch, and he has a website, or had a website, that I think he's reworking now called Realism and Policy, and he co-founded the Liberal Studies Roundtable from 2007 to 2013, an open discussion group focusing on ethical questions. We're going to be talking about realism, a term that is often thrown around but little understood, and we're going to be applying it to what we see happening in the world today. And we're also going to talk about multipolarity, Mark Carney's speech, and we'll cover a lot of ground. But how are you doing, Mike?
Good. It's been a busy day, but I'm glad to be here, and thanks for having me.
Let's start with the most obvious of obvious questions, which is, what is realism? Because you ask a million different people, they may give a million different answers.
Sure. I'd say realism is an attempt at an approach to policy that is shorn of ideological and really moral considerations. A lot of the differences may be over whether or not it is the quest for power that defines realism, or it is whether or not a nation is attempting to achieve its perceived interest. I tend to fall into the latter category. I think that realism is an attempt to achieve a nation's perceived interests. And by the way, there is a huge range of realism, as you well know. I mean, there is, of course, Mearsheimer's offensive realism, but there's also real extreme realism. You have the Realpolitik of Bismarck and the hardball, dare I say, crackpot realism of people like maybe Richard Nixon, maybe maybe someone like Kissinger to some degree, where it's a much more aggressive form of realism, and I would not subscribe to that.
You would say that you call yourself a moderate realist. What does that entail?
Well, essentially, it believes, and I believe this is in the tradition of George Kennan, that not only does a nation act best when it acts in its own interests, but when it acts with a certain degree of moderation. And what I mean by that is, if you take a very hardball approach to realism, it tends to turn people away from you. You know, if you're Nixon and you're going into a peace agreement talk, and you increase bombing at that time, that looks like bad faith. So I think a more realistic approach is if you act with moderation, and even in case liberality, some cases in liberality, it actually produces better results. And my argument also is that moderate realism is desirable because that it also produces better moral results.
Yeah, I want to delve into Kennan because I have listeners that may be unfamiliar. Now, he's most known for developing the containment strategy when it
Correct.
came to the Cold War. But one thing people often forget is as time went on, he became a lot more critical
Yeah.
of the US, I guess you would call it the military industrial complex, or he became a questioning of Uber hawks. Can you
Yeah.
speak to that more and how Kennan influenced you?
Sure. I think Kennan kind of painted himself into a corner. I think before Yalta, before Yalta and up through Yalta, I think he thought that his historical and cultural understanding of the Soviet Union and Russia was not being, especially what Stalin was up to, was not being taken seriously by the Roosevelt administration. And I think what he did was he came up with, he wrote the long telegram. He eventually wrote the X article, and the X article got the attention of Forrestal, who was more of a hardcore Cold Warrior. And I think they oversold the idea. And I think because of that, Kennan needed to walk it back. By the time the Soviet Union is falling in the 1980s, it was an albatross around his neck. He felt he had to walk it back. So, in my opinion, it was containment in Kennan that won the Cold War, or allowed for the West to prevail. But having said that, he didn't like the fact that containment had been taken over by, in my opinion, lesser advisors, lesser men, and had been escalated into, initially NSC 68, then it becomes the new look, then it becomes, flexible response, and eventually it comes back to detente, which is more like, probably closer to what he had in mind.
What
By the
was
way,
that for people that don't know? NSC 68.
NSC 68 was an initiative by Paul Nietzsche, and I'm guessing, I forget whether it's 51, 52, but right in there. And in many ways, it cemented in place the military-industrial complex. After World War II, we never fully demobilized, but in the context of what was going on in Western Europe and then the Korean War, we come up with these monster military budgets, a lot of R&D towards weaponry. And that wasn't so much a phase of containment so much as it was a parallel development in the government. But and then you have a parallel nuclear strategy with initially it's using lose the new look, massive retaliation, this sort of thing. But I think for Kennan, he saw nuclear weapons as a far greater enemy than any temporal foe. So it's like, the Soviet Union may come and go, but there are always going to be nuclear weapons. And that's why and to his credit, people like Robert McNamara and some of the other wise men of the 60s, or the best and the brightest of the 60s, the younger generation, became powerful anti-nuclear advocates in the 80s.
Do you think there's any core misunderstandings people have about Kennan as a thinker? Because he can be difficult because I think he does have a bit of an elitist streak in how he thinks and talks, but I think he's
Yeah.
also very insightful. So even if you don't like him personally, I think there's a lot to take from him. And I also think he was a profound thinker and critic.
I think you hit it on the head there. I think that's right. And I think it's something that his biographers, after John Lewis Gaddis, after the initial big biography in 2012 or whenever it was. But I think that's right. He was an elitist. He actually discusses that issue in his 1990s book, Around the Cragged Hill, where he talks about his philosophy. And he talks about elitism in a good sense, in a bad sense. And he doesn't, I don't think, subscribe or advocate snobbery, although I'm sure he was a snob at times. But he also talks about elitism in the good sense of the word. He says it comes from the old French word elect. We all try to go to the best college we can. Is that being elitist? So I think he tries to deal with that. But your point's well taken. He was a part of that very white, very male establishment of the 40s and 50s and 60s. But there's also an ugly side to Kennan, not just elitist, but actually ugly. He by today's standards, he would very much be considered a bigot. I think in his personal outlook, I'm sure he entertained views that today would be considered racist. But I think like most great thinkers too, we have to look at the area of his importance versus his failings. But you said, how do we misunderstand? Do you have another part of your
the
question?
misunderstandings people have about Kennan.
Kennan is a difficult character. He's a self-torturing man. As Andrew Bacevich said, this guy had a warehouse full of awards and still thought he was a failure. He didn't like the fact that everybody respected him, but nobody listened to him really after he was in government. I mean, Kennedy brought him back to be the ambassador to Yugoslavia in the 60s. But he's this brooding, this brooding, self-torturing, frequently depressive. You read his diary.
Well, I was going to say, even when he got older, I think he supported the Second Vermont Republic. He was into secessionism.
Yeah, well, that's the thing about Kennan. What I like about Kennan is that he doesn't have like a grandiose theory. He addresses issues as they come up. So it's like he's looking at each problem as if it is fresh and he never thought about it before. It comes up oftentimes with a solution that may seem to contradict earlier ones.
Well, I was going to say too, not to interrupt you, but I think he also, once a political issue was settled, he didn't necessarily revisit it.
Yeah, I mean, that may be true. I'd have to know examples of what you're saying, but I think that's right. I mean, he would certainly brood over them. He would write in his diaries what he didn't like about what Eisenhower or Carter was doing. But again, he also didn't like the fact that his name was permanently tethered to what he thought of was kind of a bumper sticker, which is containment. And I think he thought that when you come up with these grandiose terms, and I wouldn't say that containment is a meta theory, like say Mearsheimer's idea of offensive realism, but it is a grand strategy. It's a basis for a grand strategy. And I think he didn't like he liked the idea of having flexibility of thought, and he thought that problems were complex and didn't want overarching solutions, I don't believe.
What do you think his greatest contribution was, at least in terms of your thinking and the thinking of realists more generally?
Well, this would probably anger Ambassador Kennan, but I think you have to say that one of them is containment, which despite the variations and frankly the vandalism of later people, it still worked well enough to buy the time to allow the seeds of its own destruction, to allow the Soviet Union to collapse as he predicted in the mid-1940s. I would say his other great achievements would be really being the primary architect of the European Recovery Program, the Marshall Plan. And it's a wonderful little anecdote. He approaches Marshall and says, "How do you want me to go about this? And what advice would he give me?" And Marshall replies, "Avoid trivia. Think big. Let's fix this." And that shows you that people like Marshall and Kennan thinking big at the time. And before that, you have Roosevelt and the New Deal, and that's what impresses me. But the thing I would say about Kennan is that he was usually right in his prescriptions. And even when he wasn't right, he was interesting. Like, for instance, he was against, I believe, if memory serves, he was against the creation of NATO, and he wanted to reunify Germany in 1949. Well, that was certainly too early. It wouldn't have worked in 49, but it did happen eventually. So a lot of times when he saw things, his prescriptions, I think a lot of times he was just ahead of his time, and that's why people didn't listen to him. He told us in 1966, Vietnam is not a fundamental interest. This is a misuse of containment. Containment meant to be political, not military. Even late in life, in 1992, he advises us not to go into Somalia and gives us his reasons. virtually on his deathbed, not his deathbed, but pretty close, to 2001, 2003, he's telling us not to go into Iraq. So he himself saw this quality as being a Cassandra, as being slightly ahead of the pack. I think that's actually fairly modest to him to say that. I think he was many times considerably ahead of the pack.
I want to move into realism more generally, but maybe we can do this by talking about, do you know Anatole Levin at the Quincy Institute?
I'm sorry? Oh, yes, of course.
Anatole Levin, yeah.
Yes,
Anatole
yes.
was telling me once that a lot of times people think that realists are only concerned with war. I don't think that's true. And Anatole said that as well. He said, someone like Kennan was very concerned with issues related to peace and
Oh, exactly.
diplomacy.
I think
Same
you could
with
say,
like Morgenthau as well.
yeah, if I speak about Morgenthau, it might be out of my depth, but I think that with Kennan, he was certainly interested in peace. I think all the evidence shows he didn't like these little brush fire wars. In 1950, you have Truman, you have Marshall telling MacArthur, don't let civilian authority stand in the way of a military leader achieving success in the battlefield. Kennan's like, you go north of the 38th parallel, you could bring in the Chinese. And that's exactly what happened. So it seems to me he wanted to cool things down. But that was especially true during the Cold War, where peace was not just, preferable, but not being at peace with the Soviet Union could easily lead to a nuclear conflagration. So I think Kennan was very much involved with peace. Now, if someone is saying realists are interested in war, I think that's a misreading. I think you can say someone like Bismarck, for instance, again, hardcore realpolitik, a consolidator. He saw that the consolidation of Germany would involve cabinet wars and that it would also require knocking off France as the preeminent military power in Europe. So I think you can say if you're using Bismarck as a basis for realism, which I would not. Again, I think it's old-fashioned. I think it's harder to make a case for his type of realism today. Then you can say certainly this man used cabinet wars to achieve what he wanted to do. But I think when you're talking about, again, moderate realists today, when you're talking about people like Mearsheimer, if you're talking about people like maybe Jeffrey Sachs, Andrew Bacevich, Stephen Walt, these are very serious men and thinkers, and to me, to a person, they are all interested in avoiding conflict.
Now, moving into an essay you wrote that you sent me that I thought was very interesting, Realism and Regionalism, the United States in a Multipolar World. I would say that you're arguing that the U.S. global hegemonic era is ending. This idea of the unipolar world where the U.S. is sort of the hyperpower is ending. And maybe it's a good idea for the U.S. to voluntarily transition from a global superpower into a more regional power centered on North America. Maybe you could take us through, I guess, first what an emerging multipolar world is, and then why the U.S. needs to transition from your perspective.
Well, first of all, I think what do they call it? The monopolar moment from the collapse of the Soviet Union when there is one great superpower.
Right, the unipolar, yeah.
The unipolar moment, that's correct. Okay. I think that was largely illusory, but it had enough truth to it to appear to be correct. I think what's happening now is you have China rising quite vigorously. You have a global South community, and the global South could be a league of sort of free agents, and they would likely appeal to China and the West for favor as the West and China appeal to them for resources. China, is the emerging hegemon of East Asia, but they have, 1.3 billion people. A large part of their policy is just going to be about securing resources. So I think that where the U.S. and the West, for the past 80 years, but especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union, has had a very moralistic policy, rule of law initiatives, women's rights initiatives, and we all agree with these in principle. But we always come in, and it seems like that whenever we come into a country and we want to extract the resource rights or whatever it may be, we always put conditions. You have to have democracy, you have to have rights, whatever. China, in my understanding, doesn't put conditions on other nations. They come in, say, we have cash, you have lithium or resources, whatever it is. Here's cash in the barrelhead. We'll build you a port to help export this stuff, but they don't put the conditions on it that we do. And I think that even though we would agree morally on the bases that we would demand of other countries, at least for ourselves, where we think of obviously civil rights, women's rights as good things, this idea that you demanded of other countries, I think, has been counterproductive. And it's something that Kennan spoke about frequently. But to get to your point, so I think the multipolar world is growing up. It's been happening for a while, perhaps 10, 15 years. And so you have China, you have the West, you have Russia in this kind of ambiguous position. Are they a great power? Are they not? They're certainly a major military power. And then you have BRICS. You have the global South. India is going to be an interesting case to see whether they're going to be a leader of the global South or whether they're going to emerge as an independent power. Again, their population's holding them back. But I guess just to put this in one context, I don't want to over answer your question, but I came up with a term back 12, 15 years ago called neo-Hadrianism. And the idea is that looking back to the Roman Emperor Hadrian, he realized that in the 2nd century that the Roman Empire was overextended. And the idea was, well, let's consolidate our power. Let's continue the power of Rome, but we're overextended at this point. It's starting to work against it. And one last thing, this may be where, I don't know whether it does or not, but this may also be where I conflict with Mearsheimer's idea of offensive realism, because sometimes it seems to maintain sustainability and the vigor of a nation, you may actually have to relinquish what appears to be the extensive power in the world.
Now, one of the criticisms I often hear of realism, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this, and we'll move back to the piece about regionalism and realism. One of the criticisms I hear is realism will take us back to the 19th century and the era of spheres of influence. And, there will be a loss of these ideas like international human rights and this idea of a post-Westphalian world. Now, my argument is I don't think we live in a post-Westphalian world.
No,
I think there's
absolutely.
an illusion of it, but...
Well, to paraphrase Mark Twain, the death of the Westphalian world has been greatly exaggerated. Nations still act on their own interest. I would say that bringing us back to spheres of influence is inaccurate. And this, I may contradict myself here in the sense that I don't believe that human affairs have rule-like formulas. But if there is one rule-like formula, it is that as long as there will be large states, there will be spheres of influences around them. And, again, I say Mearsheimer has too much of a theory. Maybe this is too much of a theory. But the idea is that as long as there are large states, the spheres of influence around them will exist in perhaps a similar way that gravity exists around planets or stars. It's just a fact. We don't like the fact that perhaps Russia exerts influence, in Ukraine, for instance. But it's going to happen. You push a military pact right up to Russia's border, and you're going to get a war. It's just a fact. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets put offensive nuclear weapons in Cuba, and we responded. So I don't think it's a matter of going back. Let me add one more thing. The globalized world of today more closely resembles 19th century imperialism than realism does. Because when you have rich nations doing business with less wealthy countries, developing nations that have resources and human capital that are to be exploited, it creates these disparities that are very similar to the relationship of a host and mother nation back during the late 19th century in terms of imperialism. I would say that economic globalization is actually a form of economic imperialism. We just don't call it that.
The other argument I will hear is, since you brought up Ukraine, and I don't think it's entirely unfounded, but if we go back to spheres of influence, what's to stop a bigger nation from bullying a smaller country within the region? So Russia can just bully its neighbors, or China can bully its neighbors, or the U.S. can bully its neighbors. The U.S. can just go in and dictate Venezuela what their policy should be. So how would you respond to that?
I would say that under a realist regime, it's not in your interest to bully other nations, but you will dominate the region, and bullying does happen. During the British Empire, look how the British treated Ireland. During the Japanese, various times of history, look how they treated Korea. It's unfortunate, and a great nation should not act that way, but it will at the very least exert influence over those areas. I think, again, I think a nation acts best when it acts with moderation. In my article on realism and regionalism, part of my formula is, yeah, we're going to dominate the Americas. We are the regional power here, but it is in our interest to be a good neighbor. If we help these countries with agricultural programs, with economic development, that's better for everybody, and it will be under our influence. And if people stand up to the United States and represent outside influences, it could lead to conflict. But, you know, it's, again, I may be contradicting myself because I don't like it when Mearsheimer comes up with what appears to be a deterministic theory of human behavior. But my own deterministic theory, if I have one, would be that we may not like spheres of influence, but they do exist whether we like it or not.
Do you think there's an argument to be made that even within the spheres of influence, if a dominating power within that sphere oversteps or has hubris in how they treat their neighbors, it can actually blow back on them?
Yeah, and I think it does. I mean, I think the way the Soviet Union treated the nations of the Eastern Bloc was very heavy-handed. And I think, you know, people today are saying, oh, Russia has these plans to go into the Baltic states. That's not my reading at all. Russia was considered, rightfully so, the Soviet Union was rightfully considered a despised occupier. I think that towards the end of the Cold War, they saw it as a liability. And again, this, you know, acting in a very heavy-handed way to satellite nations and border nations, I think it's best to try to help these nations rather than to repress them. But having said that, you know, realistically, looking at human nature and looking at world history, I think you're going to get some. Again, it's hard to tell what happened in the 19th century, whether it would apply today. But again, if you're looking at the British Empire, if you're looking at the Japanese Empire, if you're looking at the American Empire, yeah, there were a lot of abuses. And by the way, my idea of regional and realism is very much against what we did in Venezuela.
Okay, well, that's an interesting point to pick up on. Why would your idea of regional realism be against that?
Well, again, if you act moderately as a good neighbor, I think you get better resources in telling people what to do. And you may notice we didn't follow up in Venezuela. They captured Maduro. You don't have boots on the ground there. This is a nation with a real military that has a sizable militia. There was another developing nation, another tropical nation that began with a V about 60 years ago, Vietnam. And we thought we were going to be able to go in there and just, you know, scare them with a few U.S. Marines. These things are always more complex. And by the way, I don't know whether he would agree with me or not. Mearsheimer may have a point on this, that it's better not to get involved in these asymmetrical wars. I don't know what his reason would. I'm sure he has multiple reasons. He believes great powers should deal with great powers. My view is, unless there's an overwhelming national interest that demands you go in there with a declared war, what is the term called? Anyway, this idea of trying to control nations from the outside or to enforce your will, it doesn't typically go well.
So I wanted to ask you, one of the quotes on your website, right above your About Me pages, there is nothing more dangerous than a true believer. I want to come back to that because one of the biggest issues you're raising is that, you know, ideologically driven foreign policy actually leads to the exact opposite of the outcomes that those ideologues often want.
Exactly. I think that's right. That's a multi-dimensional quote, I think. In one sense, as you point out, it's against ideology, because when you have an ideology, it undermines flexibility of thought. Every single solution that comes up will create spin-off problems, and each one of these must be addressed by the unique situational dictates of those spin-off problems. If you're a Marxist and you have these theories of historical inevitability, and you solve a problem and it creates spin-up problems, your ideology most likely will not give you a framework to deal with those problems. So I believe in what Karl Popper It's a philosopher I like, called piecemeal social engineering, that every single problem has to be dealt with within the parameters of that problem and the unique attention it deserves. And I believe Kennan does that. The other reason that I think that another dimension to the quote, there's nothing more dangerous than a true believer, is when you are a true believer, if you think history is on your side, if you're a radical Islamist, if you're a Puritan, if you're a communist,
A moral crusader,
a moral
or a
crusader,
missionary. Yeah.
a missionary, a missionary ideology, it gives you carte blanche to do whatever you want to people who, fall outside of the ideology. Basically, this is God's will, or it's a historical eschatology. So under Marx, it would be historical rationalism. This is the inevitable, or Hegel, this is the inevitable unfolding of history. Therefore, we can do whatever we want to encourage that. Now, I guess you can make a counter argument saying, well, if something's historically inevitable, then why do anything? This is going to happen anyway. But typically, it's not how revolutionaries work. Most of the people that I'm familiar with historically, whether they are, whether it's Oliver Cromwell, whether it's Trotsky, whether it's modern Islamists, a modern apocalyptic Christian, these people believe that they are being active agents in the world to bring forth an inevitable historical endgame. And in my reading, to date, one of the things that all eschatologies have had in common is that they've all been wrong. And the one we've been laboring under for the past, well, at least the past 40 years, is the one of neoliberal globalization. And you had people, the end of history, Fukuyama. You had people saying, Margaret Thatcher saying, this is not just a trend, this is the inevitable march of history. When you say that,
there is no alternative.
Yeah, right. There's no right. So, go along with the program, and we're all going to be better off anyway. Sure, thousands of American blue collar workers lost their jobs. So, this idea of going to an economy of efficiency and making things as cheaply as possible in parts of the world with no labor laws, with no child labor laws, no environmental laws. Maybe we should ask other questions like, well, maybe the purpose of an economy is to give people in your country a well-paying job and security, but we don't even entertain these days. I'm getting a little bit broad here, so I'm going beyond the limits of the question, I think.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about, I think there's also this criticism that, oh, well, realists are just isolationists. And I don't think that's true. No. And I also think I think you would say it's a false binary.
Yeah, people say that they're isolationists, and that maybe in a foreign affairs context, that maybe they're libertarians, that there shouldn't be any overarching laws. And Mearsheimer's point is that there really aren't any overarching laws. He's probably right about that. I think it's a false argument. I think that you have these extremes of isolationism / autarky on one side, and I think you have overextended imperialism, globalization, internationalism on the other. And one of the points of my article, the one that was in the University of Chicago, Realism and Regionalism, is that there is a huge and fertile middle ground between these two. And that rather than choosing between two false alternatives, we should fine-tune our policy and our economy to when internationalism works, yeah, let's embrace that. But why not have some self-sufficiency when it comes to economics? Why not be able to produce more? But if you have an economy relying on petroleum and it all comes from unstable regions of the world, you're asking for wars. So my view is that the truth lies in the middle. Maybe it's at times a little bit closer to isolationism. When you get Hitler, then you want a more internationalist approach, and
You cut out, you said we need, sometimes we need one approach.
Well, yeah, basically we need a fine-tuned approach. Sometimes you want to pull back a little bit and consolidate in your nation to help the economy. You want to protect, say, American jobs because it is in our interest to do that. At other times, maybe Hitler has come to power and he's rolling over Europe. Maybe you want an internationalist approach. So I don't think that I don't think this one size fits all. This either or. It's either all isolationist or all internationalist. Both of those do violence to the complexity of it, and we need a more fine-tuned outlook rather than this, black and white approach to foreign affairs.
There's one thing I would push back on because I think Mearsheimer would slightly disagree. Like Mearsheimer will talk about things like human rights. So there is some interest in international law, but I think what Mearsheimer would say is that you can have institutions like the UN, but at the end of the day, a great power that, you know, ignores the UN is going to ignore the UN.
Yeah, I think he's right about that. I think,
But
by
it
the way,
doesn't mean those institutions are completely useless, but
no, of course
yeah.
not. UN's very useful, allowing nations to blow off steam, to kind of measure the other, to see where they're really at. I think it's done a lot of good. I think his point is that simply there's that the highest level of enforceable sovereignty is the nation state, and you can enter into all these agreements, but not to use an old sexist term, they're sort of gentlemen's agreements that when push comes to shove, a nation will act out of its own interest rather than an obligation. But having said that, the Red Cross, various humanitarian relief, private agencies doing good work in the world, the Peace Corps, back in the day, the Alliance for Progress, the Alliance for Peace. I think these are all great, but they should be adjunct and separate and should not necessarily dictate policy. My view, again, is when you make foreign affairs strictly about morality, rather than national interest, you put the long-term prospects of your nation, I think, in jeopardy. And by the way, I don't think it works out. Now, having said that, there are times in history when realism and what most people consider to be the morally right thing to do align beautifully. The Berlin airlift was a perfect example of that, where clearly it's the right thing to do to save 2.4 million people from starving to death in Berlin. It was also realistically the right thing to do as a half measure between doing nothing and going to war with the Soviet Union. So there are times when they align. But I think the problem is Americans have this almost cartoonish notion of what can be accomplished militarily. And this idea that when something happens, you send in the military and it's going to fix these very complicated problems that we don't really understand.
It's not a
Somalia,
Rambo movie. Yeah.
yeah, right, exactly. You're bring in Sylvester Stallone to fix the problem. But you go, and Kennan wrote about this in '92. We think we're going to go into a situation like Somalia, where these street gangs of people hopped up on drugs who are fighting for power. There's no central government, and we're going to bring order there. Now, let me reverse that. There may be situations where it's much more clear cut, where there'd be a realistic and moral imperative to try to solve the problem, and that might be Rwanda in the mid 1990s. We got our fingers burned in Somalia, and therefore when Rwanda came up, where you had two sides, the Hutus and the Tutsis, where if you put in maybe a few battalions of UN troops with shotguns and armed infantry, you might have been able to save a lot of people, and that would have been both realistic and the morally right thing to do. So you have Somalia, where we could not have saved the situation and people got killed. And then you had Rwanda, where it is conceivable that something could have been done and we didn't take action.
Now, one of the strategies you talk about is neo-Hadrianism. What exactly do you mean by that, if people are unfamiliar?
Yeah, well, as I was saying, Hadrian was the second century emperor. And at that point, the Roman Empire was vastly extended. It was, it was the power in the West. And Hadrian thought that towards an end of Roman stability and interest, that it should consolidate. Go at the limits, build walls. Hadrian's wall, right? So the idea was, you pull back and you consolidate without further expansion at that point. Now, of course, the emperors that came after him abandoned that policy. So I think the degree to which it succeeded is quite questionable. But what my point is that the United States as a hegemon is overextended. We have a debt, what is it now, 38 trillion at this point? This is not sustainable. And rather than try to have the trappings of greater power through military hegemony and trying to stand up to China, if we pulled back into a robust regional world power status where we can still act abroad, but also take care of ourselves, I think that would be a neo-Hadrian approach that would hopefully be sustained. Let me say this too. My article talks about this, the Thucydides trap, which is when you have a hegemon which is declining and you have a hegemon that is rising. Today, back in the day, the declining hegemon in the early 20th century would have been, say, the British Empire. And the rising, or more accurately, the revitalized powers would have been Japan and Germany. And of course, 2 world wars followed that. So today, the rising hegemon is China. And the declining hegemon, in my opinion, is quite possibly the United States. And these are inherently unstable situations. The United States has all these vested interests in Japan, South Korea, less so in the Philippines now, but Taiwan, and a downwardly mobile hegemon will try to cling to its power vis-a-vis the rise of the rising hegemon, and therefore you could get conflict. One last thing on that. And it's something that I'm not sure Mearsheimer deals with. Perhaps he does. He sees nations as competing primarily to increase their power. But we shouldn't forget also that nations also have histories and personalities to some degree. And to some degree, history is also destiny. That what happened in the past determines to some degree in the future. China is a huge land empire. And as a rising hegemon, they will certainly flex their muscles. But I'm not a China expert, but my understanding is that China is not overtly imperialistic historically outside of the borders of China. There may be exceptions to that, but my view is that with China is that they would most likely rather do business with the Pacific Tigers than to try to knuckle them under militarily, so that without provocation, they would probably prefer to do business with Taiwan, Japan, Korea, rather than knuckle them under.
I also wanted to talk about the geography of the United States and where that leads, because
absolutely,
I just wanted to add real quick. People like Robert Kagan will wonder, why aren't more Americans gung-ho about supporting the American empire, American interventionism? And I think it's because most Americans understand that we're protected by 2 giant bodies of water.
Exactly. As I said in the article, the United States has the best real estate in the world. There was a navalist historian in the late 19th, early 20th century named Alistair McIntyre. So I think that's what his name was. Alistair Mackinder. And his view was that you had the world island, which is Eurasia, perhaps Africa, and the rest of the world is peripheral. And if you could control the littoral regions of the Great World Island, as the British Navy, the Royal Navy, tried to do, and to some degree did in certain areas, that you can kind of run the show on the hinterlands. Well, he's right that the Great Island is Eurasia, but remember there are also archipelagos, and the lesser island is the Americas, which is it's not Eurasia, but it is a large feature. And if you are the dominant power of the next largest island, you still have quite a bit of power. So what I was advocating here is saying, okay, sure, we have our interest in the Far East. We have our interest Australia, which is literally an island. We have our interest in Western Europe, and we can still support all of our treaty obligations there. But we have the best real estate in this country in the world. I mean, sure, you could have Russia or China parking ICBMs off the coast of East Coast or off of California and lobbying nuclear weapons on us. But at that point, the game's totally up. In terms of trying to dominate and occupy the U.S. militarily from outside, it's not going to happen. And if we consolidate our power here, it makes us all the stronger.
Now, before we move on into your second article, Carney and Thucydides at Davos, I was wondering if you could maybe talk about this and if you think there are any points where there can be reconciliation between liberal internationalists and realists on any issues, because sometimes they do line up. I think a lot of realists and liberal internationalists are agreeing that this Iran war is a bad idea. Now, they may disagree on Ukraine. I personally am kind of okay with the U.S. giving some support to Ukraine as long as boots aren't on the ground, but there's realists that will disagree with me on that. So are there needles that could be thread? Because I get the impression you're trying to thread a needle between the two a little bit.
A little bit, and I like this speech. But again, the ultimate point of this my article is, this is nice. Is it going to work? And by the way, Ukraine is another discussion I'd be happy to have sometimes with you if you're interested. But I guess let me backtrack here a little bit. Let me just offer a little apology about the article. Counterpunch puts up articles the way you submit them. I wanted to get this out there quickly before we were too far away from Carney's speech. It came out 2 or 3 weeks after Carney's speech. So there is a roughness to it. So anyone who reads it, I apologize ahead of time for any lingering editorial mistakes on it.
Well, real quick, before the article itself, I did want to, do you think there are any points of overlap or even points where maybe we could thread needles with more liberal internationalists and realists? I'm not putting neocons in there because I don't think neoconservatism can reconcile with anything.
Yeah, I would say that if a nation cannot act as an example to the rest of the world morally, then it has no business telling them what to do morally. And what I liked about Carney's speech was that he was offering this model of sort of my understanding of it. And mine is not the last word on this. I could have totally misunderstood it. But my understanding was that there was this community of third way, middle-sized nations, high-minded democracies, and that if they acted in league, they would be sort of a de facto great power acting out of interest. And the idea is that when you have a moral country acting out of its interest, you help everybody. And again, that's why I like this idea of moderate/progressive realism, that if you are a force for good in the world and you help yourself, then you help the world. And that's what I took away from Carney's speech. He also was using moderate realism as I'm not sure what the term I would use, as kind of a rallying cry against what he was interpreting to be the overreach of the United States, which
this gets into the great powers and the middle powers aspect.
Exactly, and this is where Mearsheimer might be right. And again, I also want to apologize. I don't want to say that that I'm against Mearsheimer, and I think that he and Kennan would agree on much more than they disagree with. If you look at there is almost no thinker in the world today in foreign affairs that I respect more than John Mearsheimer. My view is that, if you look at his individual analyses of events, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's China, whether it's Iran, in my opinion, he is right almost all the time. My view is that it's this larger overarching framework of his that I have problems with, but it never seems to influence his analysis, which is interesting. So if his view is the great powers are not going to let this work. And he may be right about that. I think that, again, if Mearsheimer's overarching idea of objective realism is that, historically speaking, great powers tend to consolidate their powers and deal with each other in struggles, and that for power that lead to struggles. And this is the tragedy of great power politics, name of his book. The tragedy is that these struggles almost always lead to war. I'd say, as a framework for analysis, I have no problem with that. If you're saying this is a law-like, rationalistic, historical, deterministic thing, that this is always what happens. When Hadrian wanted to consolidate power, was he increasing the power? When Bismarck did not seek empires, if he wanted to increase the power of Germany, that would seem to be the way he did it. So, this idea of increasing power becomes a very nebulous idea in the analysis. And my view is that when you get right down to it, in his individual analyses, Mearsheimer is much more of an intuitive realist, because he takes each issue as an individual issue, and he, in my opinion, through history and his own intuitions, almost always comes up with the right answer. Jeffrey Sachs, too, he's more of an optimist, but Jeffrey Sachs is very good.
Now, in terms of the middle powers speech, what did you understand Carney to be saying about the middle powers and forming a sort of middle powers bloc?
I think he was saying that the middle powers, whether it's NATO, Canada, Australia, it's hard to tell what a great power in the middle, where one ends and where the other begins. That these basically had become subservient, in some cases, maybe even vassal states to the great powers, and that this had not served the interest of these nations well. And that because of that, when you look at these nations, again, they tend to be democracies. They tend to be high-minded. They tend to be moderate in their outlook. They tend to have large middle classes, and these are powers to be dealt with. And I think what he's trying to say is that we have arrived, and that we are now going to be a power to be reckoned with. The question is, how is this supposed to work? I mean, does Canada lead a League of Nations, so to speak? And what happens when the interest of Japan and Canada diverge? So do you have this like series of different pacts based on the issue? Is it this large kaleidoscopic thing that's always changing, or is it singular and unified? And we need to answer these questions, I think.
Yeah, and you could just have a very complex web of alliances where there's shifting
Yeah.
partnerships, or it's an issues-based coalition, or there's overlapping economic alliances, or you could have a unified bloc with one leader, or you could have a situation where Carney leads but no one follows.
Yeah, well, and I think your summary is exactly right. It could be a web of different leagues, based on interests, whether it's economics, whether it's geopolitics, whatever it is. But the deal that Canada just cut with China shows that you're still going to have to deal with the great powers. And I believe Mearsheimer would say that in those situations that the great powers still have an advantage. So, is it still the great power and what they want? Is it when it's more or less equal? Is it basically charity from the great power? David Hume says that in situations where there is no equality, then you basically have charity. And on the other hand, maybe China thinks, well, it's in our interest to give them something here. So again, the devil's going to be in the details. I don't know how this is going to work out. I was intrigued by the speech. I love the fact that he stood up. It sounded Churchillian. And then in the days and weeks after it, listening to people like Mearsheimer, some of the other realists, little uncertainties and misgivings started creeping into my thinking that I love this idea, but is it going to work? And it may be an example where Mearsheimer's idea of great nation politics may prevail.
Before closing out, I'm wondering what you make of this latest venture the U.S. is undertaking in coordination with Israel going into Iran. And I know this is hot off the presses. You haven't necessarily written about it yet, but I think it's very dangerous. And I see a lot of triumphalism right now. I've even seen people quote that line from Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War, where they'll say, well, the weak suffer or the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. And I always tell people, yeah, but you didn't read the rest of it after that.
Exactly.
Because these things can go horribly wrong.
They can. And keep in mind, this is so multidimensional. First of all, in terms of pure interest, there are very few reasons why the U.S. and Iran should be enemies. I mean, it's getting back to my idea that history is destiny. We overthrew a democratically elected Mossadegh back in 1954. They captured our embassy in 1979, and this is why we don't. This is primarily why we don't get along today. But rationally speaking, they've got oil. We need oil. What's not to love? But I think it is potentially a catastrophic mistake. If you look at our history in nation building, from Vietnam to Afghanistan, Iraq, we're not really good at it, and it doesn't seem to work out well, and it never seems to work out the way you intend to. There are two things: one, nation building tends not to go the way you want it to, and two, wars. There's a famous aphorism: war is like lighting a fire, and you never know where the fire is going to go. Keep in mind too that, again, you have national psychology here. It's not just great powers. It's not like the formula. And this is what the problem I had with Mearsheimer. It's not just great powers are not just neutral things. These are countries with history and psychology and outlooks.
Well, and
Iran
culture.
What's that? And culture, exact culture, literary traditions, cultural traditions. And you take a country like Iran. Iran is Persia. This is a country that's 50 centuries old. Maybe exaggerating, but it's thousands of years old. And countries like China, India, Iran probably think of the United States at 2.5 centuries as a passing fad. These kind of countries with long outlooks, with long histories, and they will not be bullied. And you may be more powerful than them, and you may knuckle them under. But keep in mind a few things. Iran is several times larger than Iraq. It has much more varied territory. It has a much larger population. Keep in mind, chess originated in this region between India and then adopted by Iran. These are people who think strategically, and they're not going to be pushed around or knuckled under. Now, the only way that our goals are going to work of a non-nuclear Iran, no ballistic missiles Iran, is, and this is an idea that Mearsheimer had, is that you're going to need to get regime change. And in order to get regime change, we've killed off the leadership. There's no guarantee that the people who replace him are going to be any better. Scott Ritter recently said, someone asked him what he thought about the martyred cleric, the president,
the Ayatollah.
The Ayatollah, okay, right? What do you think about that? He says, you just martyred the most revered man in a religion that reveres martyrdom. What do you think's going to happen? And by the way, even if they can't hit us with nuclear weapons, there are ways they can get back at you. And you could just be opening this long, festering situation. You're continuing bad relations. My theory on this, it's an article, I wrote an article called The Persian Elephant in the Room about 11 years ago. And the idea was that short of a catastrophic war that would likely bankrupt the United States and destroy the region, Iran will likely have a nuclear weapon one day. They want it as an insurance policy because if you look at the way this country has acted in recent decades, if you don't have nuclear weapons, you sometimes get attacked or invaded.
Well, you see it with what I call the hermit kingdom of North Korea. They have nukes,
exactly,
so
right.
No one bothers them.
We don't invade North Korea. We haven't attacked it since 1953, I guess the war ended. It's still technically going on.
I mean, they may be isolated from the rest of the world, but the U.S. doesn't go after them.
They don't go after them. I mean, if they ever launched a missile, then we turn it into a crater. But I mean, but that's exactly right. If you look at, Iraq didn't have a nuclear weapon and we attacked them. So I think the realist perspective would be, if you don't have nuclear weapons, you get invaded or attacked, bombed, whatever. If you do have nuclear weapons, you get negotiations. One last thing on that point. There's this idea that Iran wants to attack Israel with nuclear weapons. Well, in order to believe that, you'd have to believe that the leadership in Iran is both stupid and suicidal. If someone launched a nuclear weapon at Tel Aviv or Israel generally, the return address would be the launch site, which would be Iran. And if you're whatever it is, 3,000-year-old, however old Iran is, if you're an old proud civilization, you're not going to wager everything on something that's not going to work anyway. And plus the fact, just realistically speaking, you're downwind from a nuclear attack, so all the fallout would land. They want it as an insurance policy. So I think a lot of us talk about they're doing this to get a nuclear weapon to blow up Israel. I don't see it.
Well, yeah, and you really can't argue with the type of neoconservatives that are saying otherwise, because their argument is, well, they're the mad mullahs. And I'm like, well, so you're saying there's no rationality. How do you can't prove that or disprove it? I tend to think that Iran has actually been, at least domestically, I don't like what they've done with protesters and all of that, but
of course,
in terms of international relations and their foreign policy, they've been exceedingly rational.
I mean,
the JCPOA, that was ripped up by us, not the Iranians.
That's exactly right. And if you look at the 12-day war, the bombing campaign last year, imagine what would have happened if someone had launched a similar campaign against the United States. I mean, they showed remarkable restraint, I think, and it showed that they didn't want to go to war. They don't want to go to war. I mean, if push came to shove, and we had a World War II style high-intensity war with boots on the ground and invasions and amphibious landings against Iran, yes, the United States would prevail. I mean, it would drive us into bankruptcy. But yes, militarily, we probably could subdue them. It is not in our interest to do that. And now we're in this tough situation where you got an expanding war with Iran, and then by some estimates, they have 2,000 ballistic missiles. They can keep this going for a while.
You
There
got
are more
Gulf
subtle
states
ways.
getting hit. The
Yeah.
energy infrastructure is all messed up.
Well, let's take this one step beyond that too. When China went into the Middle East last 10 years or so, they tried to be conciliatory between some of these countries. My sense is that the West tends to go in there to divide and conquer between Shiite and Sunni. What happens if Iran starts launching these missiles, as they are, against Sunni nations? What would happen if you got I'm not saying this is likely, and this is kind of thinking a little bit farther out there. What happens if you ignited a regional Islamic 30 Years War? I mean, what happens, what happens when Iran fires back against Sunni allies of the United States and Israel? These are people that blow up each other's mosques. These are people who are willing to fight to the end. And these are true believers. And, it's a powder keg. It's very dangerous. Not to say anything about what happens if Iran shuts down the Straits of Hormuz. I'm not sure how effectively they could do that, but they could surely cause a lot of trouble with
I mean,
the oil
they've already
flow.
essentially shut it down.
Yeah, 20%, 1/5 of all the world's oil flows through that strait. I mean, my God, it's interesting times.
The other thing that's really frightening about all of this is I've even seen people say, these so-called MAGA or America First tapes say, well, as long as we don't regime change, what if we just collapse the regime? And I'm like, that's just as dangerous, because you're creating ground for a civil war and a refugee crisis. And
right. I mean, a refugee crisis, but that could potentially go either way. On the one hand, as you point out, you have Iran's a very young country, and you have a lot of westward-looking young people there who don't like the hardcore, Shiite,
the clerical establishment,
the clerical rule. Exactly. There's your civil war. On the other hand, when you bomb a nation, you can also push people closer together. And they're like, well, we don't like these guys, but we are Iranians, they're Iranians, and this is an external threat. So God only knows where this is going to lead. I think it's a misled policy. I think we've painted ourselves into a situation where there is no clear path to go. There's no clear strategy here other than
there's no end game, and there's also no off ramp.
Yeah, well, yes, and there doesn't appear to be end game. There appears to be no strategy whatsoever, except try to degrade their military. But again, what you degrade their military, so what? I mean, with the exception of maybe Kosovo, and I'm sure some of your viewers will correct me if I'm wrong, it's hard to think of any war or any large campaign that was decided the way you wanted it to come out through just an air campaign. My dad was an old Army combat officer, and his view was, the Air Force helped us out a lot, but eventually it's boots on the ground that win or lose wars. And I think the old man was right.
Robert Pape, who has written a lot about that, would agree with you. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but
I'm not.
Yeah, he's written a book called Bombing to Win, and he does stuff on the logic of terrorism, and he's a really good professor, but he can't really find any aerial campaigns that have led to positive regime change.
Do you know where he teaches by any chance?
I actually am blanking out on the college he works at now. Let me look it up real quick.
Yeah, send it to me. Email it to me. I'd be curious to read that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an open question period, the degree to which
University of Chicago, I believe.
Oh, okay. So he's wow. I wonder if he and Mearsheimer are buddies.
Right.
But it's an interesting question, the degree to which strategic bombing works at all. I believe, and again, I'm sure your viewers will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the German military production in World War II increased until like January, February 1945, in spite of the fact that we were blowing up rubble at that point. But again, strategic bombing doesn't seem to have worked in Vietnam. Might have worked in Korea, because we destroyed almost everything in the north. But again, I appreciate what air power can do. But my dad was an old combat infantry officer, so I still believe it's boots on the ground.
I agree. There's limits.
Yeah. So.
Well, I want to thank you again for coming on Parallax Views. How can my listeners keep up with your work at this time?
I have a family member who's not in good health. I haven't done much writing since the the Counterpunch article on Carney and Davos. I took off. I had a Bluehost blog, Realism and Policy, and that just went dormant within the last month. I'm hoping to start up something on Substack in the spring, and what I hope to do is put up all of the Realism and Policy content going back to 2018 there, maybe a few of the articles I've had published elsewhere. But as of now, I'm not working on anything for publication at this minute.
Well, thank you again, Mike Duggan, for coming on Parallax Views.
Thanks, JG. Thanks for having me.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Fabian, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/parallaxviews, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.